Hey everyone, Dennis Chang here. Welcome to another video. What might be a very special video because it's probably my last time in Taiwan for quite a while. I may have found a way to exit this place. And where I'm going, I won't be able to bring this wonderful guitar made in Japan, in Tochigi Prefecture by AT Guitars. You'll find the link to the luthier's page in the description box. It's really an amazing guitar, and it's served me well for the past 2 years and a half. I'll be back to reclaim this guitar, but it will be in good hands. I'm going to lend this guitar to a buddy of mine who will take really good care of it. So I thought it would be a good idea to make at least one more video until I can play this guitar again. Maybe in the fall. We'll see how the pandemic situation unfolds. It really is an amazing guitar. I love it. And yeah, AT Guitars, made in Japan. Check them out. Today we're gonna talk about transcribing, and this is a continuation of the 2 previous videos that I did on practicing. So this is an entire series on efficient practicing, let's say, how to maximize your time when you practice. So be sure to watch the previous 2 videos if you haven't yet. But before we dive into that topic, as usual, I'd like to plug a few things. These videos tend to be quite long and very detailed, and it takes a lot of time and effort to make one video, and then to give it away for free, you have to be a little bit crazy. Maybe I am. But if you appreciate what I do, then please check out some of my courses on DC Music School or my personal Sound Slice page. You'll find the links in the description box. You can also buy some music from Bandcamp. And yeah, that's it. Thank you so much. Please like, subscribe, leave a comment. And one more thing, some of you have been emailing me for the past 2 years during the pandemic, asking me when I would resume the Homestay program that I had in Montreal. The truth is, I can't really answer that because the pandemic just turned my world upside down. And it's not a complaint, but you know, I had to learn how to adapt to this situation. Things are very different. And as much as I'd like to resume that program, at the moment, logistically, it is not possible. So we'll see what the future holds for such a program. But thank you so much for contacting me about that. But if you're into like gypsy jazz, I am teaching at Django In June this summer. You'll find the link again in the description box. It's one of the best festivals in America. And I think that festival is responsible for the, how do I say, making North America's scene grow exponentially. So yeah, I'll be teaching all week, and it's a blast. Check it out. Okay, transcribing. So there are a few things we're going to talk about. What is transcribing? Why do we transcribe? What do we transcribe? And related to that, how do we transcribe? And how do we transcribe, that can be further subdivided into 2 sub-chapters. So there's the actual process. How are we transcribing? Like, what do we look for? How do we figure certain notes out or chords? And then how do we transcribe so that you get something out of it? I'm making this video for mainly people who are unsure how to transcribe. I think many of you, myself included, have been in this situation where actually you transcribe an entire solo, you manage to play it pretty well, but you get nothing from it. Why is that? If that's your case, this is the video for you. Okay, so let's start. What is transcribing? This is very important because back in the old days, Transcribing meant, in the context of music anyway, listening to music and then notating it on paper or nowadays on computer. However, for young people nowadays, transcribing just means listening to music and figuring it out on your instrument without necessarily writing it. And I think it's important to point this out because a lot of, I see this all the time on the internet, older people complaining that that's not what transcribing means. But you know what? I don't think this definition is going to go back to its old definition anytime soon, because all the young people are using that word just to mean lifting music. So when I say transcribing, that's what I mean. Maybe you write it, maybe you don't write it. For me, for this video, it's not too relevant. Now, why do we transcribe? Of course, there can be different reasons, but in the context of jazz music, the main reason that we transcribe is to hopefully absorb the music in some way, some capacity, so that we grow as improvisers, that somehow it will help us in our improvisations. But then how does that work? Because on the other hand, you have some great improvisers who say, I've never transcribed before. And somehow they improvise. Not only do they improvise really well, they play in the style, whatever style it may be, whether it's gypsy jazz, swing music, like early New Orleans, late New Orleans, not late New Orleans, but like late 30s swing music, like in the style of Charlie Christian, bebop, whatever. There can be, of course, other reasons to transcribe, like just for the fun of it. But for this video, let's just say the purpose is to grow as an improviser. So we just focus on that. So moving on, I'd like to further explore what transcribing means. 2 videos ago, I think, yeah, it was 2 videos, I talked about great improvisers who had never transcribed before yet could improvise really well. How does that work? In fact, transcribing might not be the best thing that you can do. The best thing that you can do is to learn how to listen in such a way that you're going to get something from the music. So in order to do that, you have to use your brain and your ears a lot, both together. You have to somehow make sense of what you hear so that you can absorb the elements. And basically, the best improvisers who say they've never transcribed, that's what they've done. But as I said in that video, let's just say that I never transcribed something, but I listened to a lot of music really carefully. And actually, this is actually the case for me nowadays. There are some songs that I've heard so many times that I know how to play it just because I've heard it so many times. And because I have quite a lot of experience with music, I know, oh, it's this chord, it's that chord going to this chord, and I hear the melody in my head. So to give you an example, just a recent example, recently I've been working with some younger people, playing standards, studying standards. And there's one song that we've been playing. It's, I'm bad with names. I Hear a Rhapsody, standard. And I had never properly learned the melody before, but I've heard it enough times at jam sessions and on recordings that I just have it in my ear. And it goes like this. Or very close to that anyway. But is that considered transcribing? Think about it. Like, I heard it so many times, but I didn't actually just sit down from a recording and just lift the melody. That would be what people consider transcribing. But what I did is that I listened to it enough times that it's just in my ear, and then when I grab my instrument, I can just do it just because I can hear it in my head. So in that sense, isn't that some form of transcribing? And this is basically what the best improvisers have done who say they've never transcribed. They've listened to enough music that they absorb whatever it is that they needed to absorb, and it just comes out automatically because they know how to find those notes or those ideas on their instruments. So in a sense, everyone has transcribed. The important thing is listening. Here, as a test, most of you probably know the Happy Birthday song. Grab your instrument, try to play it. Take the note C and play it. See if you can do it. And if you succeed in doing it, and you've never played it before, well, isn't that also delayed transcribing? Because you've heard it probably your entire life, at least a few times a year. And it goes like this, right? And some of you may be even more experienced that you can also hear certain harmonies. Sorry. There's some funky harmonies. Okay? So I feel that this is a very important distinction to make. Listening is the key. And we're gonna talk about this some more in a bit. Let's now talk about what do we transcribe, and this is where it gets really, really complicated. Well, first of all, in my opinion, we should transcribe, well, you should transcribe what you like, whatever it is that captures your attention. Because when you transcribe what you like, chances are you kind of already know it, especially if it's something that you absolutely love. Because if it's something that you absolutely love, you've probably heard it enough times that you already hear it in your head in some capacity. And when we transcribe what we love, then it's a lot easier to absorb it, just on account of us loving it so much. It's already in our ears, and then all you have to do is work out the muscle memory to figure it out on your instrument. And then there's this question of whether you should transcribe entire solos or not. Well, you should transcribe entire solos if you really love the entire solo that much, or you just want to do it as an exercise to see if you can do the whole thing. You know, train your memory, train your ears, train your technique, and also being able to try to get really, really close to the way the artist interpreted the solo. So getting the timing as close as possible, the articulations, all that. That is an exercise in its own. But in this video, we're talking about transcribing for the purpose of improving our improvising ability. So it's basically to develop vocabulary. In which case, personally, I don't think it's all that important to be transcribing entire solos. Because you might be listening to a solo from someone and you might like just a few passages. And I think that's what you should focus on. So, what you like should be your priority. However, it's not that simple. You may like something, but you may not understand it. And if you don't understand it, it's not 100% sure, but there's a possibility that it will not serve you, especially if you completely don't understand it to the point where you don't even know how to use it. If you don't understand it, but you somehow know where to use it, then it is possible to get something out of it. I'll give you an example, and I remember this. This is in 2006. 2006? Yeah, it was 2006. I was in London, and my niece was about to be born. And I remember being at the hospital, waiting for my sister-in-law to give birth. And I had my laptop with me, and I was transcribing Django Reinhardt's solo, a tune called Djangology from the Rome session. And the chord progression goes C sharp minor 7 flat 5, C minor 6, G over B, then B flat diminished. At one point, Django plays these three notes. He plays an F, and an A flat, and a D flat. These notes have absolutely nothing to do with a B flat diminished, with the exception of this note D flat. The rest, like these two notes, don't fit at all. It should be, but he does this. So at that time I was wondering, what's Django thinking? I completely didn't understand. Not only did I not understand what he was thinking, in my mind I said, okay, why is he playing a D flat triad? What does D flat triad, what's the context? It goes from G, okay, then it goes to B flat diminished, which I knew was kind of a passing chord that you can sometimes ignore, going to A minor. But in the context of G going to A minor, how does the D flat fit in? It just didn't make sense at all to me. And so I could never really use that idea in a concrete way until much later, because I kept figuring out more and more music. I finally understood what it meant, that this was not D flat major but B flat minor. And actually the theory behind that is that Django in his mind was thinking B minor as a substitution for G major, because a lot of common tones. And when you have B minor and you're supposed to go to A minor, oh look, it's the same shape on the guitar. What if we chromatically use the same shape? And that's when I finally understood, oh, so that's what Django was doing when he played that improvisation on Djangology. But the way he did it, it wasn't so obvious. It's not like he was doing like a B minor arpeggio. This is also a Django idea, but in that solo, I forgot how he approached it, but it was nowhere near like that, so it wasn't obvious. So you have to transcribe things that you think you might be able to replicate in similar situations. At that time in 2006, that idea didn't help me at all. I just didn't know how to recreate it, where to recreate it. Well, I know obviously this chord progression happens in so many songs, but just to plug in a D flat like that doesn't really sound good. You have to understand how to voice lead from B minor to B flat minor to A minor. And that's what Django did, but in a very clever and hidden way, so that you, unless you were really experienced like I am now, you wouldn't know what it represented. And that's why in the beginning for me, transcribing Django wasn't always the best thing to do. And I remember like before that, like sometime in 2001, maybe even 2000, one of the first solos that I learned by ear by Django was his solo on a tune called Starry Nights, Tchaikovsky's Starry Nights. And it goes something like this, maybe not exactly like this, but something like this. Sorry. So like, whoa, what is this E flat minor doing here? I remember like, I just didn't understand how that phrase worked until I realized, oh, he's superimposing E flat minor over D7, which is kind of some form of tritone substitution if you want, from the altered scale. Of course, Django wasn't thinking about altered scale, but it's just this superimposition of chords. So depending on your ability to understand things, you might have to work on things that you think you understand. And Django can be hit or miss. Certain songs are better than others. And I remember when I was starting out, I got more out of Stokela Rosenberg and Jimmy Rosenberg than I did out of Django, because what they played, even though it was super virtuosic, made a lot more sense for my brain and my ears. They could absorb that language better. But the good news is, as you get better, your brain starts to automatically, your brain and your ears start to hear certain things, and gradually but surely the complicated stuff becomes more easier to digest. Because I remember when I was 15 years old, 15, 16, 17, I went to this teacher who told me that I had to transcribe, because that's what teachers tell you, right? Jazz teachers say, oh, you got to transcribe. But that's such a vague statement. And I remember getting this album by Joe Pass. It was a compilation. And there was a tune called Django. And this was before I got into Django Reinhardt. And this tune, Django, it's a jazz standard, originally recorded by the MJQ. And I liked it because it had a pretty cool melody. And I remember I transcribed the entire solo. I even managed to play the entire thing. It was pretty difficult because there were some double timed lines. But I got absolutely nothing out of it, because at that time, I just didn't understand how to relate a lot of these lines to the chords. And my ears also weren't very advanced in terms of harmonic progressions, because this song isn't so difficult, but at the level that I was at in those days, it was a few steps above my pay grade. So before looking at difficult chord progressions, look at chord progressions that you think you can understand. There are songs like Autumn Leaves, Blue Bossa, really simple songs like that. And maybe you might get more out of transcribing players playing over those songs than you would get out of someone improvising over stablemates, for example. But even then, it depends on how the person chooses to improvise, what their language is made up of. Because if you have George Garzon doing like his triadic chromatic thing, whatever it's called, if you're a beginner, you're not going to get anything out of that solo, no matter what song he solos over, because it's a very advanced concept. And then I remember, maybe I was like 16 or 17, my teacher suggested I transcribe this Wes Montgomery solo called Sundown because he had transcribed it. So he assigned it to all of his students. So I managed to transcribe almost everything on my own, except for towards the end when he started doing all these chords that I had no idea how to figure out. But anyways, just right off the bat from the first chorus, so it's a blues in A. So you have A7, D7, A7, then D7. So on the A7, before going to D7, Wes plays some kind of phrase. I don't remember exactly how he plays it, but what does he do? Well, whatever it is that he played, I'm not sure exactly what he played, but he started with a G major 7 arpeggio. And I remember at that time, what the hell does a G major 7 arpeggio have to do with A7? It made no sense to me. It's like, can you play a G major over an A7 chord? Is that how it works? I didn't understand that. Now it's very obvious to me what it represents. It represents E minor, and it's kind of like thinking A sus, but the theory for now doesn't matter. The point I'm making is to focus on things that you can absorb. Now, if there's something that you don't understand, this is where getting a good teacher can be very beneficial. A good teacher that can help you analyze things, but analyze in a very simple way, in a way that you can understand and then that you can reproduce. Because there are some teachers out there, and I've seen this, like people analyzing transcriptions and going overboard with the theory. It's not incorrect what they say, but it's like so overboard. Like just to give an example, like let's say if that thing, the idea of playing G major over A7, and some teacher like would say, all right, basically we're playing a G major 7 arpeggio, and it's basically the Mixolydian mode, focusing on the notes, the 13, and then the flat 7, and then the 9. No, I think that kind of explanation is not incorrect. But why not make it simpler, especially if you're a beginning student? If I had to explain it to a beginner, I would try to simplify as much as possible. I would say that you can play G major 7 over A7 because the only difference really is one note. It's this note D and C sharp. On an A7 you have a C sharp. On the G major 7 you have the note D. And it creates the sound of a sus chord. And this is the 13. And it's a sound that is very typically used in a lot of 40s, 50s style jazz, bebop. So Wes Montgomery was quite fond of this. A lot of players did this. And just for fun, I can even say that G major is also related to E minor 9. I'll just show the shapes. Look, E minor 9, and if you add the note A, you have that A sus chord. Something like that. I would try to simplify it as much as possible. So a good teacher does come in handy. Then as to what to transcribe, you also have to ask yourself, what is it that you like about it? Is it a very specific collection of phrases? In which case, that's pretty easy. You just have to copy that phrase, see how the phrase relates to the chord, and then you can plug and play in different situations. So for example, okay, so now we know that we can play, let's say, I'll just play a phrase, this G major 7 phrase. let's say that we play this over an A7. So then we're going to take a bunch of other standards, and whenever there's a dominant chord, let's give it a try. So over G7, just plug and play. Or a typical gypsy jazz lick, it's like over 2-5-1 in C. It's based on something that Django played, but a lot of Dutch gypsy players like Stoker Rosenberg, Jimmy Rosenberg play this. And that's where I got it from anyway. So on songs that had 2-5-1s, which is pretty much all the major tunes, at least in gypsy jazz, I was having fun. So that's one way to transcribe and just get something. But then there are some other players that are not really so much lick based, or at least these long licks, but they're based more on concepts and then the manipulation of what I call melodic cells, like the tiniest melodic cells. Just watch the first video, like 2 videos ago, if you want to know what I mean by that. So Django is one of those players. Is very conceptual of what he does, even though you do hear some patterns and whatnot. In fact, it's a spectrum. It's not just like pure licks or pure concepts. We're often somewhere in between. And I would say that Django is like somewhere around here, whereas a lot of the Dutch gypsy jazz players are closer to here on the spectrum, closer to the lick bass. Of course, no one is ever, well, very few people are ever like at extremes. And those who are based on concepts and such, those players require more experience, more knowledge, so to speak, to get anything out of them. Like, give you an example, if you go to my DC Music School site, if you're into like modern jazz, there's a guitar player, John Stoll. Now, obviously he has a few patterns, but he's very much a conceptual player. And just to give you an example, one of the ideas I see him repeating a lot, let's say you have a chord progression that goes like just like Autumn Leaves, 2, 5, 1, then 4, and then, okay, he'll play on the 2 chord, he'll sometimes play C7 to lead into the F7. So it's to just create a little bit of tension, a little bit of excitement. And then after, on the B flat, instead of playing B flat, he would sometimes play B flat 7 to lead to the E flat. So it's these series of dominant chords. That's one of the concepts that I noticed he liked to use pretty often. So in order to get something out of that, you have to understand, where do these dominant chords come from? Well, they're secondary dominants. Now, if you don't understand this, it's okay, but I'm just explaining to you. It's the idea that it's less about the chord that you're playing over, but about where you are going, as long as you can find a way to connect to where you need to go. So in the case of John Stoll, we're trying to go to the E flat chord. So C7 to F7 to B flat 7 to E flat. That example of Djangology is another conceptual thing. Like Django did this, but the way he approached it was something like, I don't remember how the solo goes, but it was something like, something like that. But if you listen to some of the Dutch gypsies, over this chord progression, they have this thing. And that's much more obvious. So that's something that's less of a, well, it's a concept, but it's also a phrase that you can just copy and paste. So as a student trying to maximize your, I guess, your efficiency, your learning abilities, you have to try a few different things until you can find what it is that you can absorb relatively quickly. Both, of course, the technical level, but most importantly here. You have to be able to absorb it here. For example, you see you have all these virtuoso players on my website, like Sylvain Luc, Birele Lagrène, and people always say, like, how am I supposed to learn from his solos? And I've talked about this in previous videos. With such players, well, okay, maybe you can take a few licks here and there. Some people do have the technique to do it, but I think the concepts are far more important in such players than the actual long licks. Just for example, like over let's say again A7 chord, Birelli will play a B flat minor 6 arpeggio. He might do it in a super virtuoso way, but you, if you're not like technically gifted yet, you just have to understand, okay, over an A7 arpeggio, the B flat minor 6 arpeggio sounds cool, and you can make up your own phrase based on that. Another aspect of figuring out what to transcribe is, what are you learning? Which song are you learning these days? Let's say you went to a jam session, then you encountered, I don't know, There Will Never Be Another You. And then you don't know what to play over this chord progression at the end. So then you go try to find some recordings of different players, and luckily it's one of the most recorded tunes out there, and see what the players do, and try to see if you can figure out the concepts that they're using over this chord progression. Because actually this chord progression, there are many ways to play it. It can be what I did, E flat, D7, G minor, C7, F minor, but some people do G minor, A flat 7, G minor, C7. Some people do E flat, A flat major 7, G minor 7, C7. Tons of variations. And to understand what the difference is between all these variations, you have to understand, you have to know about harmony, about the concept of tension and resolution. It's not about the individual chords, but about where the chord progression is going. And if you're interested in this, I have a course on my SoundSlice page. Again, link in the description box. It's all about harmony. It explains all this, the history behind all these chord progressions, why we can substitute one for the other. So check it out if you're interested in this. So in this case, it's more important to know that basically we start with E flat, and G minor is related to E flat, in case you didn't know. It goes from E flat, and then it goes to a 2-5, 1, and in between they have all these passing chords. And from listening to different players, I discovered like how different players would simplify things. Some people treat it modally, so they just kind of think E flat. Some players will focus on this or that chord. For example, Angelo DeBar, if I'm not mistaken, he thinks a lot da, 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 da. E flat, C7, then a quick 2-5. So what's really cool nowadays with the internet, you can go on YouTube and find different versions, so many different versions of the same song, and you can start focusing on these chord progressions that you have trouble with, and you can figure out what other players did, so that it can help you, give you ideas of what to do over that specific section, so that you have an idea how you can practice. Maybe you can find some licks that you can plug over said chord progression. So understanding how things relate to the harmony is very important. With that said, there are some people who know nothing about harmony, but their ears, they're just so talented that they subconsciously know how things relate to the harmony without ever being able to explain why. And if that's the case for you, you probably don't even need to be watching this video. This is for those who are struggling. And if you're struggling, it does help to have a certain level of knowledge. But it's also important not to go overboard with theory. Learn as much theory as you need to be able to do what you need to do, and no more, in my opinion. Because really, I say that because I've seen over the years people go really overboard with it. They can analyze things and like use all these fancy words, but they cannot play. Either you want to be a talker or you want to be a player. You can be both, but my priority is to be a player. So speaking of harmony, this is where it gets really interesting. I've transcribed tons and tons of jazz solos, but I've also investigated a lot of solos that people have transcribed on the internet. And one thing that I notice, especially with horn players, but not just horn players, a lot of people, myself included when I first started out, they take things for granted. They think that every version of, let's say, Body and Soul or whatever, is using the changes from the real book. It's not necessarily true. And then they'll start writing the chords, they'll transcribe the solo correctly, and then they write the chord symbols and they write the chords from the iReal Pro or the fake book, whatever. But that's not good. Especially if you're looking at an older version like Coleman Hawkins' version of Body and Soul. He's playing an older form of that chord progression. So if you're learning Coleman Hawkins solo and you want to analyze it, understand how to relate to the chords, you need to be looking at the chords that the rhythm section was playing, because it's an older version of body and soul, much simplified than the one that most people play in music schools. So the Coleman Hawkins changes, if I'm not mistaken, because the thing about standards is that the chord progressions were never standardized like they were today. So every person, like if you look at Louis Armstrong, Django Reinhardt, John Coltrane, whatever, you'll find slight variations in the chord progressions, because back in those days, people were a lot more creative with harmonizations. They would harmonize songs in a way that they felt would be fun to improvise over, I guess. So Coleman Hawkins, what was it? That's one version. I forgot whose version that was. It's either E flat minor to F7 or E flat minor to A flat to A diminished to B flat, A flat 7, D flat. So it's quite different from what you see in the real book. And personally, one thing that I love about older styles of jazz, like 20s and 30s jazz, is that generally the rhythm sections never played complicated chords, and they didn't stray too far away from the harmonies like you would nowadays when you play like bebop. When you go to a bebop jam session, from chorus to chorus, like pianists, people who are copying might add different kinds of substitutions and different like twists and things like that. Bass players might do that as well. But back in the old days, it was fairly consistent. So as long as you transcribe that one chorus of the chords for that one chorus, chances are for the following choruses it's always the same chord progression. And that's often what the soloist is thinking about. And when in the old days, when the soloist would do their little substitutions, it was never far out. Like that example I showed you of John Stoll's C7, F7, B flat. So that's, well, by now, today's standards, it's not that far out, but compared to the older styles, it is quite far out. So that's something to be aware of as well, especially if you're a beginner. And if you like older styles of jazz, then it's really good to be transcribing like players like Lester Young, Benny Goodman, what did I say? Coleman Hawkins, Louis Armstrong, Sidney Bechet, and all the players that were associated with such musicians. What can be especially complicated with certain jazz musicians, it depends on the musician, of course, but everyone has a different philosophy. Some people will be more conservative where the chord progression stays relatively the same from chorus to chorus. But then you have like Miles Davis's group in the recordings that they did in the 50s. For example, if you take that Miles Davis recording, If I Were Belle, okay, I want you to do this. Check out, transcribe what Miles Davis does, or go on the internet and look at a transcription that someone did. Then, if you can, transcribe what the bass player does. And do this for every chorus. You're going to notice that the bass player is playing different changes each chorus. Like, so there's certain parts where it's like it's different from chorus to chorus. Then check out what the pianist is doing. Same thing. Sometimes what the pianist does doesn't match what the bass player is doing. And each chorus, if you had to write a chart to that song based on the recording of Miles Davis, you would have to write a chart for every single chorus for every single instrument. That's how crazy it gets. So if you're a beginner, this is something to be aware of. Hopefully you have a good teacher that can help guide you. And especially Miles Davis, for beginners, is not always, in my opinion, the best person to transcribe because his playing is super conceptual. You have to have a lot of experience to get something out of Miles Davis, in my opinion. And that's why I think when you're a beginner, especially if you struggle with this conceptual style of improvisation, it's better to look at players who are more licks based. And then you have to find players who are playing licks that you understand. Like Charlie Parker plays quite a lot of licks, but I remember when I was 15 years old, learning solos off the Omni book didn't help me at all because I just didn't understand how those solos worked. So that's a very interesting thing, right? You have these players who have never transcribed, but they have clearly absorbed the music that they listen to. Then you have these players who have transcribed, who can play solos note for note, but they have absorbed nothing from what they transcribed. The way I see it is, let's say you're learning a language, and since I'm learning Japanese, most of you know this, and we also know there are a lot of people who love Japanese culture and all that stuff, like manga and anime and all that stuff. People learn lyrics to their favorite Japanese tunes. They learn the entire lyrics. They can probably sing it, but they can't speak Japanese. Maybe they pronounce things perfectly, but just because you can make a cover of your favorite Japanese tune, like a whole bunch of tunes, and sing it perfectly does not mean that you speak Japanese. In order to just speak Japanese, you have to understand the words, you have to understand the grammar. And so with music, it is the same thing. When you're transcribing, it is not enough to just copy what you hear. You have to make sense of it. If you're struggling to find what to transcribe, it's good to have a teacher help you. Again, as long as the teacher is good. Because unfortunately, I've seen a lot of teachers who recommend things that are far beyond the pay grade of the student. And this is normal as well, because a lot of people who are quote unquote advanced, they tend to forget what it's like to be a beginner. And me, despite having played music for a very long time, I'm always a beginner because I'm constantly learning new things. I learned to play the violin recently, I picked up the bass recently, learning like Japanese. I know what it's like to be a beginner. I know how real the struggle is. And you need to find a teacher that understands the psychological state of mind of the student when they're in this fragile period of their development. And again, it's not an exact science, because this is made even more complicated by the fact that I sincerely think you should transcribe what pleases you. If I told you like, oh, transcribe this Charlie Christian solo, but you not only do you not care for the solo, you find it really boring, it's hard to get something out of it. So let me just repeat. Find something that you like, find something that you can absorb fairly quickly. Try to understand what it is that you're trying to get out of that, whatever it is you're transcribing. Is it licks, or is it the concepts, or maybe even both, preferably both, but you might not be able to do both right away depending on your level. But don't worry, as you get better and better, you'll be able to figure out the more advanced stuff on account of having worked on the more basic stuff. So in this last section, I talked about what to transcribe, but also how to transcribe. So basically figure out the notes and then try to figure out the harmonies and see how the notes relate to the harmonies. And as I said earlier, with the older styles of music, it's usually a lot easier to do this, because often what the notes being played often correspond in some way to the harmonies, and if not, it's usually not a big stretch, as opposed to the Miles Davis group, where it requires a lot more experience. And then how to transcribe to get something out of it? Well, it's all that. You have to make sense of everything that you hear. So essentially, there are different stages to this, and some are easier than others. And when I was younger, my ears weren't advanced. I didn't know so much about harmony. And in fact, I always needed someone to help me figure out the chords. I was only ever good at figuring out the individual notes. And so, as a beginning jazz guitarist playing gypsy jazz, I focused more on these long lines that I could plug and play. And then after these long lines were very easy to understand, and they also sounded really cool. But because they were easy to understand, sometimes I modified them in my own way to make them my own, or just to make them easier for myself. And as my ears got better after a few years, I started to focus more on the conceptual side of things. Like nowadays, for me, it's less about transcribing than it is about just very, very careful listening. So it's possible to build yourself up to that level. but it's an endless ladder. There's always room for improvement. But nowadays, I listen to music like bebop, swing, or gypsy jazz, and I just listen. And for the most part, I kind of understand what's going on. I'll be like, oh, that's an interesting chord. Interesting substitution. Interesting choice of notes. All this just by listening, without a guitar in my hands or any instrument, without any kind of reference. And just for fun, so that we help each other out, let's say you're working on developing vocabulary. Like, which solos would you recommend for beginners, where they can absorb, where they don't have to think too much, they don't have to figure out too many concepts, where you can just take long lines and use them over other tunes? Like, for example, off the top of my head, I think Joe Pass's version of There Will Never Be Another You is pretty cool. He has some nice 2-5-1 ideas, some nice ideas over dominant chords. Red Garland is another one that I think is a very cool guy to transcribe to. He doesn't play anything too conceptually difficult, and you can just take some of the lines, the phrases that he plays with short patterns, and utilize them in different songs, different standards. Blue Mitchell, his solo on I'll Close My Eyes. As far as Django Reinhardt is concerned, again, he doesn't play super long licks, so he's more about the concept. But songs like the first recordings that he did of minor blues, he has some repeated patterns. You can see certain shapes that repeat, so that's a good one. Minor swing is a good solo, not for individual licks, but for the concepts, like the idea of using diminished over E7, the idea of adding the sixth D minor, playing D minor 6 over D minor. How does it go? See, diminished. So yeah, these are great solos for beginners. And then there are also certain Charlie Christian solos that I think are really cool for developing a bluesy vocabulary, or just to see how he interprets certain dominant chords. For example, A minor, D7 to G, a typical Charlie Christian phrase. So conceptually, it's an A minor, and then C minor. I'm curious to read your suggestions. I hope this video was of some use to you, and if everything goes according to plan, my next video will be filmed from elsewhere, and you won't be seeing this guitar for a while. I'm gonna miss her. Bye now.